Welcome to our first panel of the day, What Helped My Neighborhood Thrive? We are excited to get this discussion started shortly. Just a quick reminder, attendees, you will see a chat box and a Q&A box, both directly to the right of this live stream video. Use them to communicate with other attendees and to send questions for our consideration by our moderator. If you're having technical difficulties, check out our FAQs up top for how to get support or click the red icon in the lower right corner. With that out the way, let's get this session started. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon all, and thank you very much, Dakari, for that introduction. Welcome everyone to our first panel discussion for our 2022 Affordable Homeownership Summit. What helped my neighborhood thrive? And we are joined today with two wonderful guests. Currently, we have the current member of the City Council, Councilmember Sylvina Brooks Powers, who represents Southeast Queens in the Council, and is also the Majority Whip for the Council. We're very pleased to be joined by Councilmember Brooks Powers. We also have former Councilmember Danique Miller, who also represented Southeast Queens in the City Council and has recently left office. We're very pleased to have our guests, and what we will be having today is a short discussion on the factors and some of the issues that are facing New York City neighborhoods and how we can identify tools to help our neighborhoods thrive here in New York City. And then after that, we will have an opportunity for a Q&A. So as you think of questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box, and we will be filtering those questions out. So without further ado, I'm going to move into the first questions. For the first question, I'm going to address it to Councilmember Brooks Powers. Just based on your experience, what does a thriving neighborhood look like in New York City?
Sure, and thank you for that question, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's important discussion. For me, a thriving community is one where you are meeting the needs of the local residents in terms of their interests and desires and what they perceive community to look like. It's about investments in their infrastructure, access to quality and needed necessary resources. A thriving neighborhood is one that, essentially centers around a balance with quality of life, broadly speaking.
Thank you for that. And Councilmember Miller, for you, what does a thriving neighborhood look like? Do you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you again for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to have this critical discussion about housing, homeownership, and thriving communities and what's required. Well, for us in Southeast Queens, when we talk about homeownership specifically, and the opportunity to purchase own homes, to continue to build generational wealth in this enclave of Black home ownership, but throughout the city. What does that mean? But particularly for us, it means that we have that opportunity, but we also have an economy that supports that we have human and social services that really support the values of those communities, no matter where the communities are in the city. And if that happens and people are being engaged and are real stakeholders in their community, then that community is thriving.
Thank you for that. And, Councilmember Brooks Powers, you mentioned infrastructure as an important piece to helping thriving communities. And we've seen a renewed interest on the federal level to infrastructure. The current administration has passed through an infrastructure program. What are some of the necessary pieces of infrastructure that you see your district needing in order to move forward and continue to grow?
Oh, thank you for that question. Also, I just want to highlight when I talk infrastructure, I speak about it very broadly. So, infrastructure can look like your roads and your highways. It also can be in health infrastructure when you think about your hospitals. In my community, we right now are trying to turn the tides on decades of underinvestment in communities like Southeast Queens, where we saw, as a result of the Moreland Commission, a significant amount of closures of our hospitals that impacted Black and Brown communities. When you look at the number of beds that exist in our communities versus others, that tells a story in itself. When you talk about our roads, our potholes, how those get addressed, that's a piece of it too. And even when you talk about like our sewage infrastructure and how that is upgraded right now, Southeast Queens is undergoing, I believe it's a $2 billion infrastructure overhaul of our sewer system. That was something ushered through Councilmember Miller, as well as my predecessor, who's now the Queensborough president. And while that's great, the challenge with some of these infrastructure projects is that it takes so long, which is so frustrating, to really get shovels in the ground, that by the time it's happening, it's not meeting the need and the demand of today. And that's some of the challenges we see, and we're working to try and address to see how we can better speed up some of these type of projects, or how do we project that by the time, with the timeline, the project would actually take place, what would that need be? And those are the type of conversations I think are really important. And when you put it in the space of homeownership and where your homes are, in Southeast Queens, we have beautiful communities. We're surrounded by Jamaica Bay. We have the Idlewild marshlands. You know, we have protected grounds. We neighbor with JFK International Airport. And so these are a lot of dynamics that impact our quality of life. And so the conversation has to be brought in to really account for some of these infrastructure elements, to be able to truly give you a thriving, viable community.
Thank you for that. And just to build off of that point of all of the infrastructure investments that you anticipate, and also the assets that are in the community, one of the things that we see is that as communities gain investment, then a lot of times the longtime residents end up being displaced, and you see gentrification happening. And so one of the things, Councilmember Miller, you mentioned was generational wealth. Could you talk a little bit about how we can empower our homeowners and our communities at large, particularly our Black communities, when it comes to generational wealth, and as our neighborhoods receive investment, public dollars, and improve their assets?
Well, absolutely, and if I might digress just for a moment, and Councilman Brooks Powers articulated that so absolutely well. The investment that has to happen, but what we've witnessed over the past generations is the lack of investment, critical investment, infrastructure investment in neighborhoods like Southeast Queens and other communities of color, which kind of speaks to as we go to the next step about the generational wealth. But investment is important. When we looked at the impact of COVID, it didn't matter if you were in Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, Baltimore, or Cambria Heights. When you don't invest in infrastructure in those communities, you fall victim to those crises exponentially more than any other community, right? And so when you have to leave Cambria Heights or Rosedale or Bed-Stuy to go somewhere to see a doctor, to go to a hospital, or leave the peninsula to get to a doctor, not only is it undermining your health and safety, but it's also taking wealth out of the community always, right? And when we don't have infrastructure, the things that really matter, that was highlighted during the pandemic, those are the things that happen. And so we want to make sure that infrastructure investment, and investment really meets the needs and the values of communities, right? And that's what census tell us, right? That there's no schools, no broadbands, we live in transportation deserts, right? What are the impact and all these things that force us to go outside of our community and spend our dollars outside of the community. And so, but this type of engagement, I think, is really making people far more cognizant of an economy that supports them and their values. But it's difficult, right? And unless you have the infrastructure that makes that happen. We have in Southeast Queens nearly $1.5, close to $1.25, $1.5 billion income in Southeast Queens, but you don't really have an economy to support that, right? And so we end up other places spending our dollars, and that's that piece. But in terms of the gentrification, certainly there's things that we all have done and things that we can continue to do, things like community board preferences, which obviously there's a little pushback on that kind of stuff like that, but making sure that, you know, when we're developing affordable housing, that housing really reflects who you are, right? Specifically somewhere like Southeast Queens that has, you know, just about highest number of working professionals, particularly amongst Black women, college degrees in the city of New York, the most densely populated union community in the entire nation, which translates to the largest enclave of Black home ownership in the nation, a direct correlation between the two. So when you look at that, and we start developing housing, we're developing housing for second, third generation union members, their children, and they're earning a little more. So those AMIs and so forth have to reflect that, right? At the same time, you have to be cognizant that when you develop and when you plan communities and what communities look like, that you're sharing values. What we're seeing now for the first time is a real transition in the home ownership market, right? That for a plethora of reasons, you're not seeing African-American, African Caribbean community purchasing homes in Southeast Queens and throughout. Like there's hardly anywhere in Southeast Queens that, you know, a home is sold now that is being purchased by those communities, in particular, next generation, right? So that means that the children aren't staying or they aren't purchasing and so forth. And so therein really lies a dilemma that, you know, is not just that the generational wealth pipeline is not continuing. Do we have the wherewithal and the ability to transition wealth, right? Like, are we doing that right? Right? Because how is it that you've had, you know, this is the first generation, like, it's either properties being purchased by investors or just someone from outside the community. And so we have to do a better job. The best job is certainly engagement of generations and making sure that we're plugging in the next generation, that they understand not just that this is just not a place to live, but it's a community and it's an investment that's going to take care of us for a long time. Then you got to give them the tools to become homeowners, right? It's like, you know, if you look at the market throughout the country, nowhere like New York City, particularly in communities of color, Black communities have homes held, maintained, and exceeded their values, right? Like everywhere, all the enclaves of PG counties in Atlanta and stuff like that, it just has not been the case. Good and bad, right? And the bad part is like, how do you purchase a $600, $700, $800, $900 home, right? Where does the down payment come from? And so the affordability is just through the roof. Great programs, through not-for-profits, the center and others that have been involved that are building throughout. How do we encourage next generation to take advantage of that, as well as transition, purchase homes of neighbors and family members and things of that nature there? Those are the things that we can do. right, ourselves to kind of prevent what happens. But there is some really cognizant policy legislative work that can and should be done to protect the integrity. Now, the main thing is something that we have not been able to manage forever is the redlining and our relationship with banks, right? Because you could bank with the big boys forever, been at your job for the last 15 years, 750 credit score, and you walk in, they're just not giving you that loan, right? And that has been a problem that has led to other things, right? Because you go in the bank looking for an American dream, you end up with a nightmare because you don't get that loan, but you end up with one of the more than over the past, I think the last state comptroller report said that more than 52% of all the mortgages over the past decade sold in the greater Jamaica area have been predatory mortgages, right? Those are the things that, you know, that we have to address and deal with, but creating the framework for the next generation to become homeowners is critically important. And I think that is dialogue. I've seen a group of millennials have town halls around home ownership, but they need tools, right? It's just not enough to talk about it. And there will, some folks who have enough equity have to have the integrity to sell their home to someone that looks like them, that shares their values, that will give the same opportunity that someone gave to you, right? By selling you a home at a reduced rate, you know, and those things like that, in order for it to happen. So there are responsibilities for all of us. If you know, lived in a thriving community, you raised your children, were able to retire in a thriving community, when you leave, you should leave it so that someone has the same opportunity that you have.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Councilmember Miller. There was a lot of great information there. And I just wanted to pick up on couple of things that you had mentioned. You talked about $1.5 billion in income every year in Southeast Queens, and Southeast Queens being the largest concentration of union members in the country. I wanted to ask and get from Councilmember Brooks Powers a little bit more on this access to capital, particularly in our Black neighborhoods, particularly in Southeast Queens and New York City. We've seen, you know, year after year, whether all of the different financial institutions, whether it be Bank of America, Wells Fargo, you know, I don't want to, pretty much all of them, I'm not singling out any particular one, financial institutions engaging in these discriminatory practices, discriminatory behavior. And we've seen high rates of denial. We've seen predatory lending, inability to refinance and tap into the capital. You know, Councilmember Brooks Powers, what do you think we can do? What more can we do in order to, you know, respond and stop these types of abuses and these types of discriminatory practices?
I continue to say I think that there is a reckoning that needs to happen with these big banks, quite honestly, whether you talk about mortgages or access to capital for minority businesses. It is a huge problem in terms of the inequities that exist. When I think about even some of my own neighbors in my district, when they try to sell their homes or, you know, and get them appraised, it could be like a 10-block radius from a neighboring community, and it will be such a significant difference in the appraisal values of homes that look the same, that may even be better in my district than the neighboring one, but because of the community and the zip code that they live in, it will dictate what that appraisal looks like. The same goes for the access to the mortgage in terms of what guidelines are in place when you talk about the FHA loans and which developments accept them versus which don't. The education is important. A lot of people don't understand that when you're looking to get a loan for your mortgage, you can get a conventional loan and you could put down almost as little amount as you would on an FHA loan, and and get a good rate based on your credit, and not have to have like certain extra fees monthly because you're in an FHA loan. So sometimes people go for the FHA loan, they get denied because a particular, let's say if you're in a condo, does not approve FHA loans. Then now you feel like I can't become a homeowner now, and that's that, and you continue to rent. Education is important. Access to down payments and closing costs are important, because the bank is looking at your debt ratio. They're looking at whether or not you can afford to put these down payments down, and what have you. And so removing some of these barriers, I think, strengthens potential homeowners for having the capital that they need to purchase homes. So I think in terms of government, regulating more in terms of the education requirements on what all the options really are for potential buyers, I think it's important for us to work with the banks also in terms of what some of these criteria look like, to remove those barriers and really shine the light on some of it, because I noticed that depending on the zip code that you're in, sometimes can impact the rate that you're going to get, whether or not you can you can even get the loan, and that's right now, like 2022. Like, I know people in my district that have gone through this, so it's not like we're talking about years ago. These challenges still persist, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for that, Councilmember Brooks Powers. And I just want to let the audience know we've seen a couple of questions come in for our two distinguished panelists today. Thank you, and please continue sending the questions. We have about 3 more discussion questions that we're going to go through before we move on to the audience section. And for those of you who have just joined, welcome. We are here with our panel discussion on what made my neighborhood thrive. And we're joined by Councilmember Sylvina Brooks Powers, who's the majority whip of the City Council, and as representing Southeast Queens, and former council member Danique Miller, who is also representing Southeast Queens, and we thank them for joining us. Councilmember Brooks Powers, you mentioned, we have these ongoing issues in 2022. We talked a little bit about the history and how we got here. I wanted to, for Councilmember Miller, as a former elected, looking at some of the national issues, we see governors from Texas, from Florida, using vulnerable populations as political props and transporting migrants who have newly arrived to the United States into New York City, and creating what Mayor Adams has called a housing crisis and a state of emergency. One of the things that I wanted to ask of you is, what type of support, what type of advice would you give the current leaders on how to handle this crisis that we're in, and how to balance the housing needs that the long-time housing needs that Southeast Queens and that our neighborhoods in New York City are facing with some of the newly arrived migrants that are coming, and the housing crisis that we find ourselves in, dealing with that?
Absolutely. There are, and there are distinct differences there, right? Certainly, the newly arrived immigrant population that is coming into the city now have, a whole specific dynamic, set of circumstances around there that they're almost captured or taken from a land that they thought they knew and brought here under false pretenses, and certainly, no matter what happens, it then becomes our responsibility, those of conscious, like-minded folk to make sure that they're treated as humanely as possible, right? And that this is a city that you arrive here, that you're entitled to housing. And so let's kind of stay on that, but at what level? And so I think the first step is to really impress upon the federal government that we're willing to take on this challenge and this responsibility as we have been in the past, because that's the DNA and who we are as a city and a culture here. But we need some support, right? We need support from the federal government to around infrastructure, around, we know that there's been a lot of whether it's office buildings or other buildings that have become vacant because of the pandemic, that whether and they cannot manage under this current circumstances the way they did in the past. Well, there's a good opportunity to bring in folks, do some renovation in others, right? And that's a little more long term. But at the same time, there's some opportunities for for whatever nefarious reasons, that there are landowners throughout the city who have hoarded land, waiting for opportunities like this, right? And so we have to make sure that we're taking advantage of those opportunities. But I think the responsibility comes first from the federal government to be a supportive partner, to give us the tools to be able to support the latest New Yorkers to come in, and so that it's a lot of folk that have an opinion about how they got here or what should happen and so forth. But we have to demonstrate our humanity to make sure that that we receive them in the right way. But that at the same time, we cannot overburden the indigenous folks here with something that they have not achieved the dream themselves. And every time we get near the finish line, it gets moved back, right? And so certainly navigating that, and this is that space where we're having this conversation, genuinely, that there are folks who are concerned that opportunities being taken from them. And of course, that's the job of folks to create that narrative, right? To create that divide, particularly among communities of color, that you get something, that means you're taking it away from me. I don't believe that that's the case. I believe that the administration can do a better job in unleashing its portfolio of homes and housing opportunity, right? Whether it's HPD, whether it is NYCHA. There's been some work over the past, I'd say 7-8 years, that we've reconstructed close to 200 single family homes in Southeast Queens. With the help of the center and so many of its partners, and was able to sell those homes back to the community members, fully renovated, fully green homes for probably a little more than half of market, with a great program, obviously tax incentives and grants involved. It is just an absolutely phenomenal deal, but it is just not open to enough people, right? And then, you have all of these opportunities I would suspect that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of more homes and opportunities in the pipeline that should be accelerated, that we need to do that. The same thing with the affordable housing market, rental market, is that we have to be more efficient in delivery of the services, right? Because even with the best of intention, with all of the development that has happened, if the city wants to participate, their pipeline is probably 4, 5, 6 years down the road, right? And so where does the support come from to keep things affordable? And that's just a partnership. We have to figure out how do we recreate some semblance of 421A, right? Because clearly, there was some back and forth about its effectiveness. And I will submit to you of the nearly 4,000 units of affordable housing in the downtown Jamaica area, half of it was 421A, right? So you don't lose a program such as that and continue on that trajectory of creating housing and opportunities for these communities. So yeah, it's definitely government, starting with the feds and them bringing in dollars to support the new wave of migration, or the work that is being done from these southern states. But the state and the city has responsibilities as well. But I will say this: none of this happens with this core group that is here, the core group, the umbrella group of the center. Like my time during government, the amount of time that I spent brainstorming with the not-for-profits about next steps, about policies that support these communities was absolutely critical. Because quite frankly, you know, I was a super novice coming in 2014. I had all these ideas about what governance was going to be and walked into an absolute foreclosure crisis that everyone else would tell you that it was over, except for if you lived in Southeast Queens, right? We had a city council hearing at York College with the housing committee and the economic development, because Southeast Queens was the epicenter of foreclosure. And what came out of that was some really, really great things. The distressed mortgage buyback program, right? Which the New York City, I don't know if it still is, but it had the only program of its kind in the nation, although we work with so many other municipalities throughout the country, from New England to Seattle. We were the only ones that were really able to get it done, where we were able to purchase distressed mortgages from the federal government, which had been going to private equity and hedge funds. And the then Obama administration said that not-for-profits and municipalities would get first crack at purchasing these homes. And obviously during 45, it kind of went by the wayside, but that was an excellent program. And number one, it kept people in their homes, but if it wasn't able to, we were able to keep the homes away from the investors and in the community. So there's so many things that could happen if we're working collaboratively, and you guys continue to bring policy and this real depth of understanding of what's happening on the ground in a very nuanced way to elected creating policy legislatively, and then obviously funding it is how we really make a difference in the past. And I think if we continue along that path, that we have the tools and the resources to do it. But I will say I'm very, very much concerned about what I'm seeing, particularly around home ownership, is that it's just not happening for us, you know, for a plethora of reasons, but it's not. And I will say, as council members said, and that you mentioned, education is absolutely key. Everyone has come to me with the dream of home ownership, concerns of home ownership, and you know, the first thing I say is get yourself into a first-time home buyers program, right? Whether it's neighborhood housing services or there's so many like opportunities to do it, and it just changes everything, right? It's your preparedness and your readiness to be a homeowner. It's what your mortgage looks like, because now banks come to see you instead of you chasing them down once you're certified. It just creates so many different opportunities, and you know, I've seen it firsthand that people at lower ends of the economic totem pole do much better than others because they were prepared through first-time home buyers programs. And people think that you got a couple of bucks in the bank or that you have a salary, that's going to sustain you. But if you don't have the tools, the resources to support that, you're going to find, and in particular, when you live in communities that are constantly under prey from all of the predatory practices, it is difficult to sustain this. And so, that is the struggle. But I think if all the partners continue to come together in the way that has happened, that we can see our way through. But I will say that homeownership is at a crisis peak, not just because of the foreclosure, just because of the availability now is almost non-existent.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Councilmember Miller. You had a lot of good points there. I wanted to touch on one thing and direct it to Councilmember Brooks Powers. Maybe we could get to two if we have enough time, but one item, Councilmember Brooks Powers, that was mentioned was kind of the divide, when it comes to housing and, kind of dividing and conquering almost that you see, whether it be the real estate developers, whether it be some of the national politicians and so on and so forth. How do you, navigate that as a member of the city council, the divide between your homeowners, your renters, those that are unhoused? How do you navigate that to try to, bring the community together and create kind of more of a thriving community?
So in Southeast Queens, we are a community, and I think Danique would agree, of advocacy. The community is very united on issues such as housing and what that looks like. And as someone who is a lifelong Southeast Queens resident, this is the same space that I've grown up in. I share a lot of these same values and principles in terms of the type of housing opportunities we'd like to see. And as we have the conversation about unhoused individuals, I always put front and center the need for affordable home ownership, because I think that conversation often gets lost. And with renting, it leaves individuals at times vulnerable. Like if you have a landlord who decides I'm going to sell, or I no longer want to have a particular tenant, they are vulnerable to being displaced as a result of that. Being a homeowner, gives a level of, it gives a stake in the community in a different way. And a lot of people would like to have that, what's considered an American dream. Southeast Queens is comprised of a lot of Afro-Caribbeans that come to America with that mindset of home ownership and that being tied to the American dream. And so it's something that is, I would say, one of the top goals that a lot of our families have in the community. And so, in terms of how I function as a council member, I lead with the needs of the community, right? And so when you look at some of even the ULURP actions that I've had to take since being elected in my district, such as recently the Resilient Edgemere project, I pushed on that project to get affordable home ownership, because we have built a significant amount of rental units and not nearly enough for home ownership. And so it's about creating quality permanent housing for New Yorkers. And that's a space that I feel we in government can do a better job at, and we have an opportunity of doing it right now. And I know you asked a question earlier, even about like displacement. When you see the investments come into the community, how do you prevent that? And I think that's a space that we're still trying to get a full handle of. Because when you look at projects like Manhattanville up in Manhattan, Upper Manhattan, a part of their CBA included investing in a fund to help prevent the displacement of their local residents. But unfortunately, that money had not been really, when I looked at it about 2 years ago, it had not been spent down in a real way. And so even when you have the opportunity in the investments to create measures to prevent displacement, we need to understand like where that gap is, like what is actually pushing folks out. And I'm glad Danique raised the issue we're faced with right now, which is in the courts in terms of the community board preference, because that is something that to some extent can hold on to who's in the community much better than if it was just a free fall. And, you know, there are a lot of red tape in that folks are trying to navigate in this court case. But it's my hope that the 50% minimum local preference policy stands, because without that, you will see greater gentrification taking place across the city, and that would be unfortunate.
Thank you so much for that, council member. And we are in our last 10 minutes, so we're going to take some questions from the audience. I do have one last question, just because, you know, both of you have mentioned it, you know, and I'll direct this to you first, Council Member Brooks Powers. You talked a lot about some of the tools that you've used and that you've seen work to preserve affordable housing and to kind of build that pipeline to permanent affordable homeownership. I heard you mention sort of permanent affordable homeownership as a part of the American dream. What are some of the most important tools and, you know, that you've used on affordable housing, and how can we kind of expand them to scale?
No, absolutely. So there's a couple of tools that I've used. One, it's the ULURP process. So as a council member, we get to negotiate with developers in terms of what these developments look like in our district. So being very clear about that being the interest of the community. I think also investing in some of our community-based organizations, our not-for-profits that offer the first-time homeowner opportunities, that offer down payment assistance, such as NHS, or we have Margaret and Rockaway. So I continue to fund organizations like that. That's something that has taken place for many years in Southeast Queens, where our elected officials for generations have invested in programs like that. Also doing more homeowner informational sessions. So another thing that a lot of the local electeds that we partner and do is we hold these town hall like meetings. It's been via Zoom more recently because, you know, coming out of the pandemic, where we are talking about the opportunity, explaining how you are able to apply to get in these lottery systems for the opportunities as well, but really bringing the resources to those in our community is another way in which we do. That's a great tool. Also, because sometimes people don't know, like even me as an elected official, I'm still learning new things also. Like I learned a few months ago about the city FEPS program. That's a voucher program that you can actually use that voucher towards your down payment for home ownership. Now, can you imagine if how many of those voucher recipients knew that they can use that as a down payment to home ownership? How many people will be on the path to home ownership right now? You know, so it's about really educating the community and bringing these resources right here to them directly. And it's amazing that you all are holding, you know, a forum like this to be that vehicle, because it's extremely necessary. And, you know, like I said before, it's a lot of work to be done as it pertains to the banks. When I think about the large bank institutions and Southeast Queens in particular, over the last decade, we've seen a lot of them close. And Danique, how much money we got in our community? Billions, like $1.6 billion. And yet we can't keep a bank open. In Rockaway, we don't have a bank for several mile stretch in the community, even where we have houses selling for over $1 million. And so you got to ask the question, why are these banks closing in these communities, and why are they not investing in them? Why is it so hard for people to be able to refinance? Why is it so hard for them to get a conventional loan or the education for it. And I think that's going to take partnership in government and with organizations like yours to create legislation to better get a handle on that as well.
Thank you for that, Councilmember Brooks Powers. And one of our questions from the audience actually touches on this, and it's directed to you, Councilmember Miller. This person asked, is there a place for locally operated banks in advancing homeowners for communities of color, or do you think they're too small to just be able to make an impact?
When you kind of pose the question about banks before, I would say just bank Black or in the case of Southeast Queens, somewhere like Amalgamated Bank, which was formed by unions, and this is the largest union dense community in the nation. I think that they should have a greater presence in home ownership there as well, right? But it's where you spend your money, right? And whether or not, probably not now that they would have that type of impact that we would like to see, but you got to start somewhere, right? And once, we're a community that, you got to see it to believe it. And once it happens, people then begin to invest in a more substantial way. And the more you put in, the more comes out and back to it. But I would certainly not dismiss banks that really reflect supporting banks that really reflect your values and then not just look like you, but support your values for sure.
Thank you for that. Banking is very important, and it is about where you put your money. We could have a whole conversation just on that.
Absolutely. Some people don't deserve it, period. Right. You know that, right? Like, and especially those who have been charged, found guilty, made restitution, and they're still here making money.
Right.
After a slap on the wrist. So.
Right. Yeah. That in and of itself is another whole conversation.
That's real. Yeah, that is definitely real. Yeah.
In our final 3 minutes or so, we have another question directed towards Councilmember Brooks Powers, very specific. So it's going to be a little bit of a pivot here. But the questioner wants to know for you, council member, what are your thoughts on legalizing basement apartments in New York City?
So that is a hot topic that is going to come before the council soon. I know that I've had conversations with stakeholders in my district where there's not really much support for it right now. I have concerns about it in terms of the actual infrastructure support in it. So when I think about changing the patterns of a community, I always think about what does the infrastructure look like. And as I mentioned to you before, even with the $1.3 billion infrastructure sewage program going on right now, it's not meeting the needs of today. When you talk about increasing the capacity of a house that would typically be a one-family house, have a certain amount of people living in it, and then now you're creating these basement apartments, you got to think about what that means in terms of parking, the sewage, and so many other dynamics. So I think it's a larger conversation than solely about the basement apartments. I know that they do exist, right? And so the flip side of the conversation is wanting to ensure safety because there are folks that are living in basements that are not safe. And we saw that in the outcome in Hurricane Ida. And that's something we don't want to see. But at the same time, we have to think about what makes sense in the community. We are seeing in places like Rosedale, one-family houses turned into like literally 3 and 4 family houses. And when you talk to the neighbors on the block and what that means in terms of backups in their house and floodings on their street, it creates, I think, a community impact that must be addressed as well. So I don't think it's as simple as, just being for it or not. It's like a larger conversation that has to take place. And I know is going to be coming through the council at some point.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Brooks Powers. We have a we have about a minute left. So we have one last question that came in that I'm going to just throw it out there, and if we could answer quickly. The questioner says, the bang for your buck that affordable developers seems to be building multifamily rentals. How do we change the paradigm in order to build affordable homes for purchase? So if we can.
Zoning.
So
Okay.
exactly, zoning,
zoning.
and the ULURP process. Yep.
Yeah, zoning, and the other thing is what we've worked on collectively with community boards and certainly in the Rockaways and in downtown Jamaica area. When you build up and you create density in the downtown area, there has to be a trade-off. That means that you get to protect your low-rise communities, which is the investments of the private home. Also understanding that when we create housing, affordable housing opportunities for the next generation homeowners. Right. So we're thinking that far ahead and sharing those values. And so I think working together, zoning is probably the biggest issue.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. And thank you both. We're out of time, but I do want to thank you on behalf of the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, both Council Member Sylvina Brooks Powers, who's also the Majority Whip, and former Council Member Danique Miller for both joining us on this wonderful panel. We appreciate your time, and we thank all in the audience for taking an opportunity to listen. I will bring it back to Dakari to transition.
Hello again. That was truly such a great conversation. I want to thank Kevin, former Councilmember Danique Miller, and Councilmember Brooke Powers for really going in detail. Now it's time to head back to the main agenda page and click on the link for our second panel of the day, Borough Spotlight, Queens. It starts at 1:30, so you got a small break. Why not grab a glass of water or stand up for a minute? I'll see you in just a few.